When I started to look for patterns among a lot of my language referrals and started to look at the research focused on some origins of many academic issues associated with language, I found that many were related to poor vocabulary because poor vocabulary is linked with issues with reading comprehension. So if you look at students' vocabulary skills in the early grades, sometimes those can be predictive of later issues with reading comprehension. And the two are correlated because you need to have a certain amount of vocabulary. You need to know at least 90 to 95% of the words in the text that you're reading in order to be able to understand it. So that's why those two are tied together. And so obviously there can be a huge academic impact there. And initially, that was kind of my surface level understanding, but then I realized it got deeper than just being able to name and identify words. It was also tied to metalinguistic awareness. So our awareness of the structure of language and the systems and the rules that we use when we're using language. So not just knowing words, but actually knowing how to use words and understanding how we learn words and having a deeper awareness of that. So people who have this strong metalinguistic awareness are better able to learn vocabulary, and people who struggle to learn words and have lower vocabularies tend to have poor metalinguistic awareness, which is tied to difficulties with academic skills. Now, I want to dig into those a little bit further because I know I personally, when I first started practicing, did not fully understand all of the components that went into our word knowledge and how we actually learned words. So let's go back to that question of what we really mean when we say vocabulary. So first, remember that all of those 5 components that I just showed you are all interrelated and impact our vocabulary knowledge. So I'm going to talk about phonology and orthography first. So first of all, in order to be able to use a word, so remember part of word knowledge is being able to actually use the word. So in order to do that, we have to have a good phonological representation of a word. We have to know how to say it and know how it sounds. So that means that there are some of those words where we might recognize them when we hear them, but we can't quite put it together to actually say the sounds, to actually say the word with all the sounds in the sequence. So we actually have to be able to reproduce that word. And I know that sometimes articulation errors might impact that for some of our students, but we have to have a good picture of how to put those sounds together in order to be able to use the word effectively. So part of knowing a word is having that representation of the sounds in the word. But then it goes a little bit further, and I mention orthography and phonology together because the sounds and the orthographic symbols are tied together. So in order to fully be able to recognize a word and truly know a word, part of our understanding has to do with our orthographic representation of a word. So we have to know how to write it and know how it looks in print. Now, obviously, some people struggle with spelling and they might have a pretty good command of spoken language. But when we're talking about academic difficulties, this orthographic representation can have a significant impact on a student's performance and on their comprehension when they're reading, and also their written language skills. So being able to reproduce the words is part of our vocabulary knowledge because it has to do with how we're able to actually use those words. So again, we're talking about the linguistic components of orthography and phonology and how they impact our knowledge of words. So of course, there is always more to the story. And we know that phonology can really help with impacting our students' ability to read, but there's more to it than that, especially when it comes to word knowledge. So there are some other components we need to consider as well. So one thing that we need to be aware of is that in order to truly have a very solid understanding of a word, we have to know how to use words across different contexts with varying sentence structures. So we have to know what a word means, but we also have to know how to put it in a sentence, and we have to know what to do with that word, because we won't use the word if we're not sure what to do with it. We also have to be able to modify the word by adding appropriate morphemes. So some words we might add an ed at the end to make it into a past tense. Some words we'd add different morphemes to actually change the class of a word, so to change it from a noun to a verb. So we have to know how to be flexible with language and know how to do that. And having a solid understanding of the word will allow us to use the word with different forms. So that is another feature that impacts our ability to learn vocabulary. We also have to be able to make sense of sentences that have the word in it in oral and written language. So this ties these pieces together. So not only do we have to know how to use words, but when other people are using words, we have to be able to comprehend that. And if we don't have these pieces in place, then it's hard to understand what's going on when we're listening to a discussion in the classroom, and it's also hard to make sense of text language when we're reading. So of course, we are talking about the linguistic components of morphology and syntax here. And as you can see from this graphic, they all tie into vocabulary as well, and they're all linked to each other as well. So they all have some overlapping features. Now, we have one more feature to consider when we are thinking about what we mean when we say vocabulary or word knowledge, and that is semantics. So when we are talking about semantics, we're thinking about content knowledge, so our ability to describe words using multiple features and describing multiple characteristics, our ability to explain what words mean, and our ability to remember the semantic features or characteristics of words. So when we're initially exposed to words, we have a first impression of what we think that word means, and that's when the process of fast mapping occurs. So we're able to attach some meaning to that word when we're first exposed to it, and then we gradually fine-tune this over time. And that's true for all of these 5 features of vocabulary. So all of the essential 5 that I'm describing right here. But with semantics, we're gradually able to attach more semantic information to a word as we're exposed to it. So obviously, the main linguistic components we're talking about here is that we need to have semantic knowledge in order to have a fully functional understanding of a word and how to use it. And all of that ties in to our ability to say the word, write the word, use the word in a sentence, and use it with different morphological forms. So all of these tie together, and we need to have a solid understanding of all of these linguistic features in order to use a word effectively. This essential 5 can function like your framework or your curriculum for language therapy, because if you work on emphasizing all 5 of these features with your students with language issues, you are covering most of your bases, and you are covering one of the key areas that causes students to have academic difficulties. But as you know, when we refer to a curriculum, we're talking about something that's not individualized. So we can't necessarily have a standard curriculum like the teachers have, because in order for it to be appropriate for our therapy, we need to make it individualized for our students' needs. So what we need to do is select the specific components that our students need work. So of those 5 areas that I just covered, we want to identify the areas where our students need the most help and then focus on those. And then we need to add the secret ingredient that helps us do more by doing less, which I call adding the meta. And what I mean by this is that we need to directly explain those rules of language that I just covered with the essential 5, relating to whichever one of those components, or probably multiple components, your student needs work, and you get students to think explicitly about these rules. A lot of students in the standard curriculum can just kind of figure these rules out on their own, but we know our students with language disorders can't do that. We need to be very direct with them and fill in the blanks and explain how these rules work. So we need to show them how to think about language. We want our students to think explicitly about these rules and focus on the components they need, because this is how we can individualize our therapy, but still use some type of a consistent framework that helps us stay organized. And why I say this is the secret sauce is because when you teach students to improve their use of metalinguistic strategies and increase their metalinguistic awareness, what this does is gets them to think about language differently, which helps them to become independent learners. And that's what we need to get that generalization that we're all chasing. And that is how we can actually get better results by doing less, because we are teaching our students strategies and to think about language differently so that we're not having to spoon feed them every skill that they need to know. When we can show them how they can be more aware, this can help to give us a bigger bang for our buck so that our students are actually using the skills that we're teaching them. So once we figure out what areas our students need work, then we can work on really hitting those areas that they need. And even though this is a complex process, when we have a system for doing it and we know which areas we should focus, then that can help us to make sure that we're making every second count with our students. Now, for some kids, it's very clear what areas we need to work. Sometimes we feel like our students need help in every area. And I'd love to get into each one in depth, but it's not possible to do that in just an hour session. But I do want to tell you one thing that you can do in at least every area so that you can start to implement this right away. So with phonology, obviously you can work on improving students' phonological awareness by doing different blending and segmentation drills. And a lot of times teachers are doing this in the curriculum, so you may or may not need to address it with your students. But if you are targeting vocabulary and you want to give your students a good phonological representation of words, one of the easiest things you can do is just have them say the word. So make sure you give them lots of opportunities to say it and make sure they do it again and again. So I say it, repeat, repeat, because you want to give them as many opportunities to actually use the word as possible, because that'll help solidify their understanding. And then we also want to solidify that orthographic representation of the word. So one of the easiest things you can do for that is just to make sure that they see the word in print and that they have many opportunities to write it. So again, just like saying it, part of being able to know a word is to be able to use it. And you need to practice using it in order to do that. So that's why it's important to give students the opportunity to write words and to be able to see them in print so that they are better able to recognize them. We also want to address morphology. So I say morpheme study, and what I mean by this is that we're just practicing using words with different morphemes attached to them. So for example, if we're using verbs, we might practice with different endings like ed, ing. If we are changing the class of words, we might use different prefixes and suffixes on a word and talk about how those prefixes and suffixes change the meaning of the word. So we really want to draw students' attention to those meaningful units within a word, because we've got to go beyond just the sounds in the word. We've got to figure out those meaningful linguistic units and draw our students' attention to that. We also need to help our students to understand those semantic features, because our students with language issues sometimes don't catch on to those as easily, and we might need to be a little more direct with them. You can do what's called semantic feature analysis. And this is basically when you're going through and you're training students to be able to describe words using different semantic features. and you're showing them ways to remember the different features. So for example, when you're describing nouns, you might want to teach our students to be able to describe a word using the category and then describe it using the function and physical features. So we're making them more aware of the types of information that they can use when they're describing words, because a lot of times our students don't quite know how to do this. And then last, with syntax, I say practice, practice, practice. We need to give our students opportunities to use words in sentences. Now, of course, you will also want to directly target some specific syntactic structures, but the easiest way you can get started with that is to just have them try to put it in a sentence and give them different examples of ways that they can do that. So these are some things that you can do right away to make sure that you are hitting the essential 5 while you're working on vocabulary. Really, all that I've done here is piece together existing techniques and put them into a system to organize it and keep it focused. I haven't invented anything brand new here, just structured what already existed in the research. What I found when I applied it to my own practice was that activating this metalinguistic awareness made all the difference for my students. So now I want to tell you about a couple of those early cases I had when I was just piecing this all together. So the first student I will tell you about, I will call Jay. Jay was referred to me when he was in 2nd grade, and he'd been struggling for the last 2 years in reading. And by the time I got the referral, he was about a year behind his class in reading, but he was tested and he didn't meet criteria for a specific learning disability. My evaluation showed that he was about 1.5 standard deviations below where he should be in an expressive language. One of the tests I gave him was the Language Processing Test 3rd edition. So he had to do things like name word associations, list items and categories, and explain meanings of words. So like most of my referrals, one of the major issues was vocabulary. With Jay, I knew that he wasn't particularly strong with any of the 5 linguistic components I mentioned, so I made sure to hit them all in some way, but I emphasized some more than others. I addressed phonology and orthography on a very basic level by drawing attention to how specific words sounded and looked in print. So I'd simply make sure that he had many opportunities to both say and write words that we were working on. The other 3 areas, morphology, syntax, and semantics, were a huge struggle based on my assessments, particularly because Jay didn't know what words meant, nor did he know how to recognize and use them with different grammatical markers. And he didn't know how to explain what words meant using correct sentence structure. So my therapy for him focused on explaining semantic features of words. But I went beyond simply discussing the features, such as category or function. I also had him practice using words in varying types of sentences, which targeted syntax, and also worked on showing him how to use words with different morphemes attached, so he could see how to use the word in different forms. As he started to learn some of the rules of language, we made some breakthroughs. Now, let me tell you what happened with Jay. I evaluated him at the end of 5th grade when he was going to middle school, and he'd been getting therapy for about 2 years. After 2 years of working on the skills I just mentioned, Jay was passing reading and came out within the average range on my formal evaluations. Because he'd improved so much, the IEP team made the recommendation that we discontinue special education services, so he was able to go to middle school without special education support. This experience was kind of surreal for me because up until this point, when I dismissed a language case, it was usually because the student had plateaued. So it usually felt like I was giving up because there was no progress. But this time, I was actually discontinuing a student because they were better. And for once, I actually felt like I did my job. And I've been able to replicate this same result with other cases using this system, which has been huge. And I'm confident that you'd be able to do the same thing too. Let's look at another case. This student we'll call Missy. I worked with Missy primarily in 3rd through 5th grade. And this was a clear case of a student who struggled with vocabulary. Her teacher told me one time that they were reading a story about a ghost in the attic, and she didn't know what an attic was, so she had no idea what was going on. And situations like this happened all the time for her. It was a case when vocabulary was clearly the culprit. And when I was working with her, she started out about a year below grade level, and it seemed like the gap was continuing to get wider and wider. She was also another student who was low, but not low enough for the psychologist to even consider testing to see if she had a learning disability. So I was on my own as far as providing services. And my evaluation showed that she had a mild to moderate impairment in expressive semantics. And she just had a really hard time attaching semantic information to words and really having that deep understanding of word meanings. For Missy, because semantics was such a significant area, this was mainly what I focused on with her. So we did detailed analysis of semantic features, and I showed her different mnemonic devices and strategies she could use to self-question so she could cue herself to pay attention to specific parts of words, such as category, function, physical features. In one example of a strategy I taught her to use was the expanding expression tool. So with this explicit and direct explanation of word meanings, she was able to cue into these semantic features so she was more effectively able to learn words on her own. And we simply repeated and got lots of practice with different types of words so she could solidify these skills. Missy's story ended similar to Jay's. By junior high, she was functioning without an IEP. Her formal language assessments showed all of the linguistic components were in the average range. And the best part of it was that she was able to use metacognitive and metalinguistic strategies independently, so that she was able to teach herself word meanings on her own. I didn't have to teach her everything. I simply showed her how to teach herself. I've said before that having a system is where the magic happens, but know that I'm speaking metaphorically. This isn't magic. It's simply teaching our students to be meta so they can be more independent. The truth is that neither of these cases were transformed to straight A honor students. They still have to work for it. The difference is that we got to the next level for them. We got them over the hump so that they could see enough progress to make a lasting change in their habits and the way that they think about language. We're not talking about perfection here. We're talking about progress. So now that we know the framework that we can use, the next step is to figure out how we manage all of this, plus all those other things that we have to do as therapists, like consulting, paperwork, planning, meetings, etc., and still manage to have a life outside of work. How do we piece this all together? So my answer for you is that we find our sweet spot. And what I mean by that is that we figure out how to do just enough that we're thorough and effective and no more. And the reason we do that is because there comes a point when doing more work actually doesn't get us better results. And we've got to find that happy medium between the two. This is known as the law of diminishing returns. So basically what that means is that there comes a point when doing more work will no longer improve your outcome. So we've got to find where that is. When are we just being busy to be busy and not really getting more out of what we're doing? So we need to have a good system for figuring out that happy medium. And I want to show you the process that I use to do that with my students who have language issues. I like to refer to this system as the sweet spot or the SPOT framework because it allows me to hit that happy medium of being thorough and efficient at the same time. Here's what the acronym stands for. S is for standards, P is for present levels, O is for outcomes, and T is for treatment. Let me go through each one and explain what it is, why it's important, and how you can go about making sure you address it. Let's first talk about standards. Standards include any expectations or demands placed on a student in their environment. For a school, this would most likely include the curriculum and the expectations of the classroom settings across the school day, which is highly relevant even if you aren't in the schools, because academic settings have some of the most challenging language that school-age children will encounter during their day-to-day lives. Sometimes the home and social settings are less formal, so the linguistic demands may not be as high. Unless, of course, you have a student with pragmatic language issues as well as academic issues. Understanding the standards is one of the key components to determining what is appropriate to address with your students, because you can't figure out where the deficit lies unless you have a good picture of what's considered typical and what is needed in order to be successful in that situation. The issue, however, is that just because something is expected of a student doesn't mean that we're going to automatically address it, because we have to consider whether or not that student is ready for that skill or task. We also have students who might do well with certain expectations, but not others. So we obviously want to pick and choose based on what the student is able to do. So we need to not only determine where we want our student to be, which would be the standards, we actually have to consider where the student actually is, which is the present levels. And we can do this through several ways. So let me give you a couple examples. We obviously want to consider the data we've taken during therapy and during formal evaluations we've conducted, which are very specific to discrete language skills. But then we also want to consider academic performance on other measures done in the school setting, because these are very language-based and they give a good picture of whether or not those language skills are transferring to other tasks. Last, we want to get input from any stakeholders involved to see how the student is performing. So part of choosing what things to emphasize in therapy would include where you're going, which would be the standards, and then part of this process is knowing where you currently are, which is the present levels. Now, I mentioned before that I sometimes felt like a chicken with my head cut off trying to consult and do paperwork. And part of the issue was that when I'd go to talk to a teacher or when I'd plan, I didn't actually know what information I was looking for. So I didn't make the most of those conversations or the time I spent looking through data. When I got clear on what information I needed and why, I started asking better questions and getting better information. And I didn't spend as much time trying to make sense of it all. This also helped me formulate better written summaries for my paperwork, which cut down on the overall time I spent doing paperwork. Next, the outcomes. What are the desired outcomes of therapy? In other words, what are your goals? Although this framework is not necessarily linear, it generally makes sense for us to have a good picture of both the standards and the present levels before we come up with our goals. Because in order for us to determine the desired outcomes of therapy, we need to figure out what's expected or where the student is. And only then can we determine what goals a student needs to meet in order to get them closer to meeting those standards. Now, the topic of goals could include a day-long lecture. I could go on and on. But instead, I'm going to tell you the cardinal rule of writing good goals. And that is, if you can't see it, you can't measure it. In other words, if you use vague verbs that aren't observable, it muddies the waters, which makes it difficult to determine if your student has met the goals, and also makes it difficult for you to complete the paperwork. For example, words like comprehend and understand don't cut it. You can't see someone comprehending or understanding. You need to state the behavior that shows how you know they're understanding or comprehending, such as following a direction or answering a question. Being specific can give you a clear focus on what you want, which leads us to the final component. Last, we have T for treatment. Now, it's important to distinguish between treatment and your outcomes or goals. Goals are simply the behaviors you want to see to show a measurable means of progress. They're like a thermostat, if you will. On the other hand, treatment is the techniques or tasks that you use to help meet your goals. This could mean that you might include activities in therapy that don't directly involve the task stated in the goal, if the tasks will have a carryover effect and improve the student's ability to complete the goal. Remember that goals are not strategies. They are simply metrics to let us know how we're doing. So this is the component that would involve that language therapy curriculum I talked about in the last video. If we've done our work up front, we know which specific skills of the essential 5 we should be emphasizing based on the student's needs, because we have a clear picture of where we're going and where the student currently is, and what our intended outcomes are for therapy. Using the SPOT framework, you determine where the student needs to be, where the student currently is, the goals you need to meet in order to help the student meet the standards or get closer to them, and the ways that you can measure progress. And finally, what meta treatment techniques you need to use, and which components of the essential 5 to incorporate in order to get the student to meet the goals. If you follow this process, you can streamline your treatment planning, and you won't be left scrambling, wondering what you should do next with your students. You'll have a clearer picture of where you're going and what to do to get there. Now, I've used this framework to get the results that I've just shared with my own students, and I hope at this point you have enough information that you can take these ideas and use them to make sure you're hitting all the necessary components your students need so you can teach them to be meta, so they can think about language differently, because that's how we generalize. I've also used the SPOT framework to stay efficient but thorough, and that's how I've been able to finish my doctorate at the same time that I've been a full-time SLP. It took me 8 years, but I made it. I also got the Director of Special Ed credential in the process, so that's my excuse for why it took me so long. And throughout this time, I've also been able to spend time with my family and have time for my own extracurricular activities, because I was absolutely adamant that I was going to find a way to change my students' lives, but still have a time for my own life. So I know that was a lot of information, and I want to pop back into the chat and see if there are any questions. So there will be a slight pause here while I switch back over. So for now, type your questions in the chat and I will be right with you.